thanks very much, everyone. So I think we'll kick off because I know we've got about an hour, and I think it'll be 40 minutes for the talk and then 20 minutes for Q&A. So it's my great pleasure. I'm Kerry from the LAwTTIP Institute. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Snyder. Were I to read you his CV, we would use up about 20 minutes of the 40 minutes. So I'm just going to say that he is the CV star, Professor of Law, and the EU Jean Monnet Professor at the Centre of Research on Transnational Law. Long and distinguished career in many different places, so he will address us this evening, and then we will have an opportunity to have some dialogue with him. So Professor Snyder, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I also like to thank Oana Stefan and the Center for European Studies for the invitation to talk to you. This is a very long title from a very long paper, and I'm going to focus on the parts that I find most interesting. If you want to read the full thing sometime, you can find it. And so I'd also like to thank my co-author, who's now on an exchange program from Peking University with the University of Stockholm. She's one of my students, actually, and our students are all graduate students. And she's also my research assistant, and we've been writing several papers together. This is one. And so there's a beautiful picture to start off, and I'll tell you a little bit about the paper. This paper started life after I finished a book on food safety law in China. And, you know, after you finish a book, you have a kind of grace period. People don't expect you to do anything immediately, and so you can wander around in your mind and think what you might like to do next. And it seemed to me that there were a couple of major challenges for food safety in China, and one of them is pesticides. And so I decided to work on that. And so I've reduced the whole paper to the PowerPoint, and I hope this is very clear and very logical. First of all, and here I guess I'm speaking to the students because the colleagues know this all too well, to start research, it's necessary to have a question, and then you can try to figure out what is relevant, and when you finish the research, whether you've answered it properly. And so I'll get to the research question in a second. And then the scenario unfolds. The scenario, basically, the narrative is that China, which now produces 55% of the world's apples, has a very large export potential. And this paper is about that. And it starts off with a long section, which I'm going to leave out, mainly about the economics of the trade and so on. And then I'm going to look at the obstacles, legal and regulatory. By legal, I have a broad view. Law includes legislation, administrative regulations, and also standards. So it's not the typical Chinese lawyer's view of law, and perhaps not European lawyers either. And the other element in this paper, as you will discover, it's interdisciplinary. That has many meanings. Here, I used law, of course, and a lot of international trade material, international economics, and some economic sociology, some business material, which in my mind is the most interesting part, as you will discover. And then we'll look at some Chinese policies. And then the argument is that the policies used by China today to develop their export potential regarding apples, you know, it's a good example. It's important fruit. The set of policies in relation to Europe can be seen as a kind of regulatory collaboration. That's the argument. So it's not regulatory competition, which we might have in mind when we think of the difference in food safety standards. And it's not regulatory cooperation, which is well known in the trade literature, because the two partners have too many differences of views, different objectives, and so on. And so I discovered this term, regulatory collaboration, actually on Wikipedia, and then in the education literature, and it seemed useful. So that's the argument. And so the research question is quite simple. There's a context, of course. The context is that trade conflicts about food are very common between Europe and China and many other countries, and Europe and the US and Canada and so on. They result not necessarily from bad faith, but usually from diverse assessments of risk, different conceptions of risk management, and different institutional structures. You know, if you look at standards, we all know that food safety standards are double-edged. They're designed to protect public health, but at the same time, they provide barriers to entry in markets. And it's almost inevitable that standards play that dual, sometimes contradictory role. So this paper starts off with with a background that China, it is often reported, has very low food safety standards. Things have improved dramatically in the past 5 or 6 years, but I start from the position that that's the case. And I ask myself, if that's true, how can China export food products to the rest of the world? I will not go into why I chose apples or why we chose apples. It was my choice actually at the beginning, but it's a good example, I hope, to try to answer this question. And the legal part focuses on a very technical part of standards called maximum residue limits for apples, and we will see a little bit about that. So look at the export potential. This is, I'm going to skip over most of this. A few facts. China is the world's largest apple producer, 55% of the world production. It exports, most of the apples it produces are eaten at home. That's true almost everywhere. China exports only about 4% of domestic production, mainly to Southeast Asia, but also to Russia. You read in the literature that these countries were more interested in the price than the quality. And that's, of course, not true in Korea or Japan or US or Europe. Therefore, there's a challenge for the Chinese exporters who want to get into these markets. And the consumption, the paper goes through this, is increasing in the world for many reasons. Main ones are changes in per capita income. In Shenzhen, where Peking University School of Transnational Law is located, near Hong Kong, the per capita income, I don't know, has maybe gone up 10% a year per year since I've been there. It's really dramatic for everyone. I mean, maybe not law professors, but factory workers and, you know, business people and so on. And another is changes in diet. Fruit and vegetables, we know, are better for us than meat or sugar or salt or fat, and so everywhere we see changes in diet. And then, of course, concerns for public health, which are very important in Europe and also in China. So if we take the position, we take the standpoint of the potential exporter in China who wants to get into foreign markets, particularly the European market, and that's what I'm going to talk about mainly, but also the United States, there are some obstacles, both international and domestic. Excuse me if you're taking photos. You can read about this. This is the published paper. I don't think the site is on at the end, but you can take a photo of the citation and some other relevant. It's much more interesting than the PowerPoint, I can tell you. I have it here. It's a very long paper. And anyway, there are several obstacles, and the first one are international standards. And I'll just say a word about this. International standards of food safety, as many of you know, are made by the Codex Alimentarius in Rome. The Codex is a joint creation of the UN Food and Agricultural Organization and the World Health Organization. It's been around a long time, created 1963. In fact, there were private business standards for some products, milk, for example, before the Codex began. But the Codex standards are not legally binding. I think I did not mention this yesterday when I talked to the students who are interested in soft law. But the Codex standards they're not legally binding, but most countries follow them. That because now they are the ground, the baseline of international food safety standards, because of the WTO appellate body decision in a case called European Community Hormones, beef hormones. And so the appellate body did not say that these standards are legally binding, but it said that those are the international food safety standards. And in fact, countries like China follow it. China has another role I should mention. China now, the Codex is divided into it works through committees. Horizontal committees, the mandate of which covers all products, and vertical committees. I didn't mean to stop you from taking photos. I just didn't want you to waste your time. You can take photos if you like. I don't mind. And the vertical committees, which are product specific or topic specific. And China is the chair of the Codex Committee on Pesticide Residues since 2006, 2008. Maybe I'll discover the figure a little bit later on. China joined the WTO on 11 December 2001. And then after a transition period, got very active in the WTO, of course, and in other international organizations. And so for the Codex, I'll go to the next slide. You can see this one pesticide, which we use as an example. It's an insecticide. The Codex has a standard of 5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. That's for the residue, in what we eat. And China has the same. It has the same level for many reasons, partly because China probably has an important role in making the Codex standard, but also because if it's easier, it's cheaper to take the Codex standard and plug it into your own legal normative system, your legal system. You save the money on the technical expertise, on the machinery, and so on and so on. And you can see that China has the same standard. In Europe, however, this product has been banned for 25 years for agricultural use. And that means that although it means that basically there are no residues of this fenpropathrine in food. And so the EU, if there's no agricultural use, implements a default standard, and you can see the current default standard is 0.01 milligrams per kilogram. In other words, basically zero. And so if products were to come in from China with this, with the Chinese level, complying with international standards, the product would not be allowed into the European Union. You can think about the Brexit and wonder what might happen after Brexit, but this is not what I'm going to talk about right now. And so you can see the potential trade conflict. And this is just one example. Of course, there are many other examples. And so the other obstacles from the point of view of the Chinese exporter are Chinese law. Chinese law there are several elements here of Chinese law. One is the Food Safety Law, 2015. I may mention that I played a role in this because the Chinese government leaders asked me to give advice in 2013 about how to reform the food safety system in China. And a lot of my ideas are in the 2015 law. Of course, there are many other experts who were involved, Chinese experts in particular, and I suppose there was a convergence of views about how the law should be reformed. And so the Food Safety Law 2015 says that farmers are not allowed to use pesticides which are banned. It restricts other pesticides, and it says the government will gradually get rid of highly toxic and toxic pesticides. And then, in addition to that, this is reiterated in the law about agricultural products, which used to be quite separate from food safety law, and it's also reiterated in the pesticide regulations. You can see that on the board. Regulation for the control of agrochemicals. And if we look at from the exporter's point of view, the interesting thing is that the Food Safety Law 2015 says that if products are exported from China, they have to meet the standards of the target countries or the standards in the contract. Now, any lawyer would think, there's a choice. We have an option. Let's see which one is the most likely to come to fruition. And so that's what we'll see as we go along. And then we look at the EU law. EU has very high standards for food safety and many other things. The EU positions itself as a model of standards making in the world. And in the EU Food Safety Law 2002, Regulation 178 in 2002, there are three aspects which may be of concern to potential exporters of apples into the EU. One is the precautionary principle, which essentially, as you know well, I'm sure comes from German environmental law, and then migrated up to international environmental law, and then down to the EU food safety law. The EU also has in its food safety law the term other legitimate factors, which is of code word to mean that the European Union, when it manages risks, does not have to do so exclusively on the findings of science, of risk assessment. It can introduce other legitimate factors, for example, public attitudes or other elements. And then third barrier in the EU is the rapid alert system for food and feed, which started in 1979. And it's a network of the European Commission and all the member states, which inspects, well, like everywhere, a small minority of imports. And if it finds a problem, notifies the other parties in the network and can admit the product or reject it or just make notice that there could be potential health risks. So these are some of the obstacles that our hypothetical exporter may confront. And so I'll skip over the next one. China, and for the moment I'll use the shorthand, has tried to develop different strategies or policies to improve agricultural exports and, of course, other exports as well. And so the argument I want to make is twofold. First of all, these three policies here are not separate. They're a set of policies which go in the same direction, at least so far as this topic of export of fresh apple fruit is concerned. And secondly, I'll come to at the end, this amounts, when we look at the relation of China and the EU, to a form of regulatory collaboration, and I will come to that in a few minutes. So first, let's look at these three elements. First one is alignment. Alignment is a term of well, art is to distinguish an expression. It means our national standards, or regional in the case of the EU, the same as international standards. So if China or EU tries to align its standards with international standards, it means that it's trying to make its standards converge with the international standards. And so the first part here is about alignment. Now, I don't have time to go through all the Chinese law about standardization. There's a lot. Not all of it's legally binding. Some of it's legislation. Some of it is administrative measures. And some is non-legally binding notices and things like that. There's a lot, really a lot of rules about pesticides. With this, my co-author for this paper and another student, another graduate student, we did a paper for Professor Pervis Umbanson's volume on Jessup at 60, transnational law, and we found out that there were 140 different measures affecting pesticides in China, ranging all the way. In fact, that's a very modest estimate because ranging all the way from international standards, conventions, and so on, down through Chinese legislation, and we only chose 2 of the 35 Chinese provinces as examples, the main apple provinces, and we only chose 1 city. But often the cities have their own standards for pesticides. We only chose Xi'an, where the terracotta warriors are located. But 140, that's a lot. So if we try to dissect this alignment issue, I made a distinction between 3 different levels. Standards in general, like shipping and so on, food and everything else, electronics, food safety standards, and then maximum residue limits for pesticides. And so if you look at the chart, you can see on standards in general, about 75% of Chinese standards are the same as international standards. If ISO or the Codex or accounting standards, who knows, whatever it might be. And then if you try to find out food safety standards, what is the percentage of alignment? It is very difficult. It's very difficult to find any reliable statistics. And so the best guess, and it's not my guess, is about 50% of Chinese standards for food safety are aligned to international standards. And then if we look at the residue limits, maximum residue limits for pesticides, it's about 78%. That's pretty high. A lot of it's recent because all WTO members are required to notify to the TBT committee or the SPS committee their standards, and China recently notified a lot of standards. But, and you can see the but in big letters, the problem is not the law on the books. The problem, well, it is actually, it's that China has not adopted very many standards, very many maximum residue limits. The Codex has adopted about 28,000. China, the People's Republic of China, has adopted about 5,000. So there's a lot of work to do. There are a lot of products, in other words, food products for which there simply are not maximum residue limits. This is part of the reform, the transformation of the Chinese economy toward domestic consumption and so on, which is going on now. Second part of this set, here's some notes here that should not, I don't know why they're there. That's for me, I guess. Maybe you can't see them. I don't know. Second part of the export strategy is what I found most interesting. And this is where law meets business. And the Chinese government, 2007, a white paper on food quality and food safety, published by the State Council, mentioned an export strategy called One Pattern and 10 Systems. And I'll say a little more about that as I go along. It derives from the policy strategy, and we had a discussion about the policy yesterday. And here, these policies are legally binding. They're not legislation, but they're policy documents. The first one is State Council, the National Congress of the Communist Party, September 1997, which said, "Grasp the big, let go of the small." And that means develop national champions, not necessarily state-owned enterprises, and let the small ones sink. And that's what's going on. That's the SOE reform, which has been going on, sometimes not very rapidly, for a long time. And the second element of that was in the late 1990s, Jiang Zemin, the president, then called for a going out policy or a going global policy. So he and Zhu Rongji, who had been the negotiator for China in the WTO process, they encouraged Chinese enterprises to go abroad, foreign investment. Go to Toulouse, buy the airport, half the airport. Go to Piraeus, a third of the port, and so on and so on. You know, we know this has been developed on a massive scale now. And so these policy documents were followed up by the Ministry of Agriculture and other ministries who said, we will select leading enterprises which have a chance of conquering export markets, and we will support them. We'll give them the technical expertise, we'll give them the money, we'll educate the farmers about how to meet international standards, and so on and so on. The tremendous advantages. And the State Council used this formula, one pattern, 10 systems. What it meant was, you can see a quotation in the next paragraph. This is from the State Council white paper. The creation of closed supply chains limited to elite export-oriented companies and farms. So that was the idea. And from the legal point of view, there are two things which I found fascinating. One is, this is all closely supervised by the government. This sometimes you read in the literature on developing countries that cooperatives and farmers are companies searching for a way to get into the European market or the American market. This is not that. This is pushed by the Chinese party state through the Ministry of Agriculture and the administration of quarantine and quality supervision, inspection and quarantine, the AQSIQ, AQSIQ. They're in charge. And the second thing from the legal point of view, which is interesting, is that they use private standards, non-legally binding standards, international standards, and I'll give some examples. Let me just go ahead here and see what's coming up. Okay. What does one pattern, 10 systems mean? You know, the Chinese love numbers, with all due respect to the Chinese in the room. If you read Joseph Needham's classic work on science in China and so on, you will know that Chinese numerology is very sophisticated. And so this is an example. One pattern, 10 systems means one pattern, which is enterprise plus base plus standardization. Base means in the agricultural field, the land. So enterprise plus base plus standardization. The 10 systems are 3 for supervision at the source, archiving management system, epidemic disease monitoring system, supervisory system for pesticide and veterinary medicine residue. And then 3 systems for factory supervision: hygiene registration, classified management system for enterprises, and then resident quarantine official system for large enterprises producing high-risk food for export. For example, seafood. Somewhere between 30% and 70% of seafood eaten in the United States comes from China. And there are special procedures under the FSMA, the Food Safety Management Act in the US for dealing with this. And then 3 other systems for product supervision: legal inspection and quarantine system for exports, quality tracing and substandard products recalling, an early risk warning and quick response system. And 1 last system for credit building, because the government has set up a red list of approved export enterprises and a blacklist for enterprises which are not allowed to export. And so that's 1 pattern in systems. And you can see 3 main characteristics. Maybe they come along later in the PowerPoint. 1 is the role of the government. So this is not a group of farmers or companies alone trying to get into European or American or Japanese or Korean markets. Those are the markets which, for apples at least, have the highest standards. The government plays an essential role. Secondly, the companies are not large SOEs. There is 1 very large SOE in the food and agricultural sector, but it is not involved in the apple export. It's involved in the juice export, and something like 70% of apple juice in the US comes from China. But these companies here, it's not that, and I'll give some examples. Third element, which is significant from the legal point of view, is that private, international, non-legally binding standards are used to ensure quality, and they, in effect, replace the national Chinese food safety standards, which are legally binding. Food Safety Law 2009 and also 2015 said food safety standards are legally binding. It's not like the Codex or whatever, but it's not legally binding. But here we have higher standards which are used by companies and by contract. You remember the food safety law phrase I gave you before. And so these are parts of the going global strategy for exports. So I think I have about maybe 8 minutes left, and I'll nearing the end. So there's a photo of people packing apples, one of the hundreds on the internet, somewhere probably Shandong province or Shanxi province, I'm not sure. And so some examples. Give 3 examples. 3 examples are interesting, I think, because they're quite different. You might think, from what I've said already, that the going global, the strategy, export strategy in this sector concerned only state-owned enterprises. But that's not true. So the first group is called Shanxi Huasheng, and a very long title. It is part of that is the largest exporter of fruit in China. Established in 1997 in the Los Plateaux, north of Xi'an. It's a subsidiary of a bigger group, which was registered in 1988. It's a typical Chinese business group, like the Japanese or the Korean business groups. Its activities include plastics manufacture, chemical materials, building materials, agricultural new technology, production of pesticides and other agricultural materials, purchase, storage, sale, and processing of fresh fruit, and so on. It's not really an SOE, even though the Xi'an city government contributed 20% of its registered capital, 20 million renminbi at the time. 20 million renminbi must be about 2 million pounds, something like that. And so then the second group is different. The second group is Leyang Hunran Foodstuff in Yantai. There are two main apple producing areas here. One is Shanxi, north of Xi'an, where the warriors are, and the other is Shandong province on the east coast. And Yantai is a very nice port city, which is the home of French wines in China, many chateaux, a lot of good cherries and good fruit. And this company it's a joint venture. It's a joint venture with Taiwan. So a typical joint venture, not an SOE at all. It's a private company, a particular type of private company. And it has now a capitalization, according to the literature, of $618 million US. So it's a big company. It's not a big, huge company. It's not a huge SOE. It's a private company. And it was named, as was the first one example I gave you, an advanced corporation, a leading agricultural export, a famous brand producer, and so on and so on. And so this company operates according to international standards, and I'll leave out the first one, but it's very similar. The HA, Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Point System, ISO 9000, Quality Management, ISO 14000, Environmental Management, American Institute of Bakery, Food Safety Standards, and the GAP management system, and its products are exported here. France, USA, Japan, Canada, Australia, and so on. And then the third example is really very different. The third example is called the Food Chain Partnership. It's also based in Yantai in Shandong province on the east coast. It is one of 240 similar partnerships in the world, in over 30 countries, which cover most fruit and vegetable crops. And you can see the list of the partners involved in this. Bayer Crop Science, this is the famous German agrochemical company. Ag Value Biotech, which is a technical service company. It works with farmers, small farmers, about pesticides, water use, and so on. The third one is Joy Wing Mao. Joy Wing Mao is listed on Bloomberg as a private wholesaler and distributor of fresh food based in Shenzhen, where I teach when I'm not in Europe. And it was one of the first fruit producers in China to receive the Global GAP certification, which is one of the standard certifications. It was China's largest fruit supply chain company. And then it merged in 2015 with Jovio. That's why it's called Joy Wing Mao now. Jovio is a company under Legend Holdings. You will know Legend Holdings because it's a major computer company, I think founded by students at Peking University, if I'm not wrong. And they now own and manage the Hangzhou Longguan Industrial Tea Company, which produces my favorite Chinese tea, which is Longjing green tea. And Legend invested more than 1 billion renminbi in Jovio to completely integrate the Chinese market in this crop and others. And so it's an enormous, they own land, they have 60,000 mu of orchards, 6 overseas farms. You know, China has expanded into Kazakhstan and Central Asia to feed its population and so on. And it drives the development, according to the literature on their website, of 1,200,000 growers. So it's a huge operation. And it's a private company. The other one, of course, here, the other partner is Walmart. We all know Walmart, the world's largest employer. It's the largest food retailer in China. It has 439 retailers in 189 cities as of 2016. And it was one of the first supermarkets to participate in the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Commerce farm program. They have a lot of direct, a lot of contract farming, and so on. And then there are over 1,000 farmers here. And so these 3 examples are so different from the point of view of company law and even probably of government strategy. But one has to keep in mind that China is a party state. The Communist Party and the government decide what happens at this level of policy. And so you can see the examples that I've used. And they, quite apart from the characteristics, the legal characteristics I've mentioned, they're fascinating really in terms of the academic literature on economic development, because they all integrate small farmers into international trade. And if you compare it with other examples. And finally, my final example, and I have maybe a few more minutes. I don't know.
About a minute.
Okay. International cooperation. International cooperation, the most interesting one here. China has been very strategic in making international agreements. And the one here that's most relevant is called the Apples Protocol. It's actually China-Poland Sanitary Quarantine Permission Agreement. Xi Jinping, the president, went to Poland and created an international Silk Road Forum in 2016. And part of this arrangement was the Apples Protocol to allow China to export apples to Poland and allow Poland to export apples to China. And the government, and you can see there, the government, State Council #1 document, policy document, said, we will support agricultural companies along the Silk Road, One Belt, One Road, the OBOR project. And from the legal point of view, what is fascinating here about the Apples Protocol is this is with the part of the 16+1, the Central and Eastern European countries. So not all of the 16 are EU member states. So from the legal point of view, the question would be, is this an international trade agreement from the EU point of view? Or is it an economic cooperation agreement between member states and non-member states of the EU, which is allowed under the 1985 Trade and Economic Cooperation Agreement with China, which is still in force? So, conclusion. I mentioned this already. A set of policies, they look very different, but they fit together. They dovetail together very well. This is a form of regulatory collaboration. The 2 parties, Europe and China, have different objectives in many ways, but they cooperate strategically here to achieve shared or overlapping objectives. And if you look at this from the Chinese perspective, one can see, and maybe not only the Chinese perspective, that this may be the beginning of a new world food trade order, strong government support, selected elite enterprises, private standards, and what I called fragmented regulation, which means that the export standards and the domestic standards are different. This is true in China. The export standards for apples through these companies is higher than EU standards. It meets the Tesco, Sainsbury's, and all the supermarket standards. But the Chinese domestic market standards are lower. So there's some further reading. You can see there's Professor Zumbanson's volume, not out yet as far as I know. And then there's my book on food safety law. So thank you very much.